I wanted to do a pretty background like you guys, but it makes me look like I'm floating in a weird, weird place. So I'll just have my room background.
I liked it.
Oh.
Roberto.
Okay, good evening, everyone. For those of you that are already here, we're just going to wait a couple more seconds, let everyone get in the room. Numbers keep jumping up quickly, so thanks for being here. We'll get started in just a minute. Okay, I think we're good. So good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Colorado Virtual College Fair. We're excited that you're all joining us, and we have a great session for you tonight. I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping announcements before we get started and turn it off to the pros that are going to talk to you about gap years. So biggest thing to know tonight is that your cameras and microphones are all off. So the panelists, we can't see you, we can't hear you, so don't worry about any of that. Just enjoy the session. We do have the Q&A button on your screen, so that if you have questions at all throughout the presentation tonight, feel free to type that Q&A or that question into that Q&A section, and then we have some time reserved at the end for those questions. And if we don't get to them, someone will follow up with you after the session as well to answer those questions. This is just one of a lot of different sessions happening tonight and the rest of this week. So be sure to check that list and go sign up for additional sessions that you might be interested in. There's a lot of great information, a lot of topics, a lot of colleges and access professionals that are here to help and happy to answer your questions. And last but not least, we are recording this presentation, so it will be available within about a week at the same website that you registered on. So you can just keep checking back there if you want to review it and get any of those questions answered. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our presenters, and they'll kick things off. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can see them.
Good evening. What is a gap year? Basically, taking the year off after high school graduation and before further academic studies. Graduate and take a year to plan the rest of your life, or think about what it is you want from more education. It's a pause to reflect and take time to move forward, all while engaging in life. Hi, I'm Dr. Kathy Klug, an educator, a college counselor, and the founder and director of the 16-year-old Colorado Western Slope College Fair that's part of this event tonight. As an educator and public school college counselor for over 20 years, I was committed to helping students find their way to college. I've focused on four-year colleges and universities, community colleges, trade education, and every path to get kids what education they needed after high school. When asked about a gap year, I always paused. Years ago, I would say, a gap year? That's a little undefined. It is a different thing to different people, and it's a little too loose of a concept as an alternative to college. That's what I thought then. Now I'm open to a gap year as an idea whose time has come. In some cases, it's a brilliant path. But I'm on this panel this evening to ask those of you who are trying to find out, what is a gap year? How do I put a gap year together? And whether it's right for you, to stop and ask a few questions. Learn how to make a plan that is the right fit and match for your year. What is a gap year? It's what you make it. Let's find out the opinions and facts of a gap year from me, a high school college counselor, from a college admissions officer, and from a business practitioner at Verto, gap year specialist.
Thank you, Kathy. That was awesome. Hi, everybody. My name is Lainey. I'm an admissions counselor with Verto Education. So there is a huge world of gap year out there, and we are just one tiny little niche in that huge world, I'd love to just go over pretty briefly about the different types of gap year options that students have. Um, there is a pretty there are a lot of ideas of what a gap year is, but in reality, there are a lot of different gap years. So a gap year is, yeah, it can be anything from um, a chunk of time after high school that a student is staying home and working, or just staying home and volunteering. It can be a chunk of time after high school, whether it's a year or not. Gap year kind of falls under that whole umbrella. A chunk of time where a student is traveling abroad. So I know that travel abroad gap years are very popular these days as well. And well, I'll back up a sec. There are, I think, four main types: immersion, volunteer, personal, and academic. So these can be abroad, they can be domestic at your home, in your hometown. All of these can. So a personal gap year would be kind of what I mentioned, is just taking some time off that's very unique to a person. So this is maybe working, or maybe helping her out, helping around your household, or helping out around your hometown. So personal gap year is something related to your hobbies and interests, and that can be at home and that can be abroad as well. This could be, starting a pickup soccer league in your town, or this could also be starting a food blog, for example. So personal gap years, there are so many different gap years under that personal gap year umbrella. A volunteer gap year, it sort of emphasizes leaving a positive impact on places that you visit and people that you meet. So this can be anywhere from graphic design, which I know is super popular these days, or like sustainable agriculture, for example. And these can be working alongside your local community. These can be traveling to a different state. These can be traveling to a different country as well. So volunteer gap year is all about, leaving that impact with someone and getting in return the benefits of new skills and experiences. An immersion gap year is another type of gap year that students can take. This is where you spend, an extended period of time surrounded by a different culture, essentially. So like immersing yourself in a different world than you're used to, getting yourself out of that bubble. So this is generally includes things like living abroad, living with a host family, taking language classes, just engaging in different cultural activities like firsthand, and just like getting into that community and becoming a part of that community. So an immersion gap year is really awesome for sort of pushing students out of their comfort zone, and just learning how, other cultures, other communities, different traditions, learning about different global issues. So immersion gap years are also incredible. Then there is also academic gap year. So an academic gap year is, they can be offered by colleges, and they also can be offered by gap organizations. So there's a huge array of those as well. So they're a really good choice if you do want to continue, learning even during your time off, which gap years are not ever time off. They're very, very unique to each person. So they are, yeah, it can be through like college level courses. You can be taking college courses on your gap year, and some can be taking more like lower level academic coursework. Some gap year programs have the option to be an academic gap year if students want to take a couple semesters. Yeah, so any students who kind of want to explore their academic interests maybe in more depth, just without the pressure of having to choose that major while they're on a college campus at that moment. So there are so many options within those. And I also wanted to just talk about where students and families can find their gap year options, where you can kind of like peruse through those. There are individual gap consultants. They are spread out all over the states. and they know the ins and outs of all these different gap year organizations, and they can work with you sort of like an independent college counselor, essentially, just relating to gap year. The Gap Year Association is a really awesome place to start. They have a lot of resources about why students might want to join a gap year, and about where to start looking for one, essentially. You can also find gap year consultants on the Gap Year Association. So I definitely recommend people start there if they are curious. And Go Overseas is a really incredible website. So Go Overseas is kind of this big hub of every type of gap year organization out there. So you can go in and type what you're looking for. If you're looking for academics, if you're looking for Australia, if you're looking for anything you want, you can just type it into Go Overseas and see all of those options. So it can be very overwhelming, but I feel like once you have an idea of maybe what sort of type of gap year you might be interested in looking for, that's a really great place to go to start. There is also every year in the spring, which we'll see how this spring goes, but every year in the spring, there is it's a circuit of gap year fairs that go all across the country. So I believe they start in New England and then travel over west. So those gap year fairs are hosted at local high schools, and you can attend, and it's just different representatives from different organizations just telling you more about that. So that's also really exciting, and I believe you can sign up on Go Overseas to get information on that as well. And just a shameless plug, Virtual Education, who I work for, we do academic gap years. It's a fully accredited college semester. So definitely, if you're interested, check us out.
All right, well, thank you, Lainey. So my name is Karen Dobbin-Scherer. I am a Senior Associate Dean of Admissions at Lewis and Clark College. Lewis and Clark is a small private traditional liberal arts and sciences college in Portland, Oregon. I've been in college admissions for over 25 years, working with lots of different populations. So I've had quite a bit of experience working with students who are considering gap years and have taken gap year programs. So in today's session, kind of the role that I'll be playing is just talking generally about how colleges and universities view gap years and the role a gap year might play in the admissions process. I'll tell you just a little bit about the options that Lewis and Clark has for students taking a gap year, or at least considering a gap year. And then I also want to spend just a little bit of time giving you a few things to think about, again, from the college perspective, if you're considering doing a gap year. So I think probably the thing I want to start with is the most important thing, and that's how do colleges view gap years? I think for the most part, they are a positive thing. There is nothing inherently wrong with taking time away from a formal academic setting. I think that's something that families and students are often express concern about, is that it's going to look bad in a college application having a gap year. And that's not necessarily true at all. As Kathy, I think, is going to talk about, there are a lot of different reasons why a student might choose to take a gap year. And then, as you've heard from Lainey, there are countless ways a student might choose to spend their gap year. You could do some international travel, whether that's through a program like Verto's, or maybe you're just going to have a solo adventure. This is something that Lewis and Clark sees a lot, or at least we did before COVID hit. Like, that's awesome. What college wouldn't want to see a student who has spent some time overseas having an amazing time, right? This is something we absolutely approve of. Some students choose to do, they'll work for the year. Sometimes students will do something academic. Maybe they're taking classes through their local community college, or maybe they're working with a tutor. Maybe they're doing it just for personal enrichment. Maybe they're trying to, bump up their knowledge in a particular academic subject. Those are all great things too, right? There's nothing negative negative about taking a year to work or to spend time studying something that you're interested in. We've had students that have taken a year off to help out with their family. So maybe there are elderly grandparents and they're going to go help care for their grandparents for a year. Maybe there's a brand new niece or nephew in the family, so they're going to go provide some childcare. We've had students who have taken a year to do a mission. We've had students who have focused on pretty intensively on a certain art, so dancing with a ballet company for a year, going off to work on a election or a campaign. These are all great, wonderful things. There's nothing negative about spending a year doing this sort of activity during a gap year. So again, for the most part, colleges and universities are going to look pretty favorably upon a gap year experience. One of the questions we had is, what isn't a good gap year experience? Is there something that a college will look at a student taking a gap year as kind of an unfavorable thing? And I'd say the only thing that tends not to be viewed very favorably is the year that a student takes to just kind of check out of things. We totally get that you might need a mental break from school. If you need some time between high school and starting college, that's absolutely fine. But if you're going to spend that year just chilling at home, hanging out, watching Netflix and doing some online gaming, that's not a good way to spend your gap year program, right? So we always encourage students to have some production during their gap year. We want to make sure that you're doing something structured, that you're doing something productive for society during your gap year. So yes, you could absolutely take that mental break, but get a job, get involved with some service work, find some way to spend your time constructively as well. Okay, so again, I think that colleges do absolutely recognize that gap years have the potential to be truly life-altering experiences. They can really build your sense of independence, they can add maturity, they really can expand your worldview. The potential for growth, personal growth, academic growth, emotional growth on a gap year is really huge. And colleges will recognize that the experiences that you have, you're going to be bringing those to our campuses. You're going to make our community a more interesting place for everybody else to be. So again, for the most part, colleges and universities really do have a favorable view of gap years. Now that said, I do want to point out that every college and university is going to have its own little policies in regards to gap year. So you always, always, always want to reach out to the colleges that you're interested in before you get too far along the way of planning for your gap year. You just want to ask those questions. Ask what a gap year policy is for a college or university. Make sure that they are indeed viewed favorably. Check to see whether you need to apply for admission before you leave on your gap year, or can you apply for admission during or after your gap year. If you are doing a program that grants some sort of academic credit, some college credit for the program, make sure you ask if those credits are going to be transferable. Not every college is automatically going to grant you transfer credit for that work. So you just want to do your research ahead of time and make sure that you're asking the questions you need to if you're spending a productive year. All right. So there are a couple of different ways you can approach applying to college when considering a gap year. You can apply before your gap year, or you can apply during or after your gap year is concluded. There are benefits and disadvantages to doing both. Here at Lewis and Clark, in a typical non-COVID year, we'll typically see 30 to 40 students who choose to defer their enrollment to Lewis and Clark for a year. So that represents the vast majority of gap year students that we at Lewis and Clark will see. So these are students who apply for admission to Lewis and Clark while they're still seniors in high school. They're admitted to the college, they decide they want to attend Lewis and Clark, but they want to defer their enrollment for a year. So they're going to take a gap year before they come to Lewis and Clark. And that's a great way to approach your gap year experience. That means that you can be on your gap year and not have to worry about applying to college, right? That decision is already made. You know what your plan is for when your gap year ends. You don't have that hanging over your head during your gap year experience. Now, of course, the downside to doing it that way is that your gap year experience isn't part of your college application, right? You can't really include your experience on your application if it hasn't actually occurred yet. So if you really want a gap year to be something that really enhances your application to college, if you're planning on doing some academic work to give yourself a boost in your college applications, you're probably going to want to wait until you're into or after your gap year experience has concluded to apply for college. So the other approach is waiting until you're in your gap year, until your gap year has concluded to start forth on the college admissions process. And that's a fine way to approach doing this as well. And we'll see a handful of students each year at Lewis and Clark who choose to do that. We understand that not all students are ready to make a commitment to college before their gap year, so that's absolutely fine. We recognize that gap years are oftentimes really life-altering experiences, right? The person that you are and what you thought you wanted when you start out on your gap year can turn out to be very different by the time you are finished with your gap year. So waiting to apply to colleges is absolutely fine. Now, the downside to this approach is that it might be easier to apply for admission to college when you're still in high school, right? You have ready access to your teachers and your counselors. You can ask for those letters of recommendation, put in those transcript requests. You don't have to worry about having access to those people. They're right there for you every day. If you are not in high school and you're trying to complete your college applications, it can be a little bit more difficult to make sure that those connections are being made, to put those requests out there, to do that follow-up. And this is something particularly to think about if you're considering doing some travel during your gap years. You have to think about, when am I going to have access to my email? When am I going to have access to a reliable internet connection? It can be really hard to apply for colleges and to do that follow-up that you're going to need to do if you don't have ready access to the internet. So that's just another component that you want to really think about. So again, whether you apply before or whether you apply during or after your gap year experience, both ways absolutely work, but that is something that you want to double check with the colleges and the universities that you're interested in before you get too far along in planning for your gap year experience. Okay, so finally, what I want to say is that COVID-19 has really changed the landscape of gap years. As I said, typical year, we'll see 30 to 40 students who choose to defer their enrollment and have a gap year experience before joining us at Lewis and Clark. This year, we had over 100 students who applied for fall 2020 and decided they wanted to defer their enrollment and have a gap year. We totally get that. COVID-19 has really shaken things up. We found a lot of students who weren't ready to head off to college in the middle of a pandemic. They just weren't sure what was going to be the best situation for them. So we absolutely had no problem granting those gap years to students who wanted to take a year and kind of figure life out. What we're seeing this year is we're seeing a lot more students who are choosing to do some sort of academic work during this gap year. So they're taking courses through their local community college or their local university. We're seeing a lot of students who are choosing to work. We are seeing a lot of election workers, and we think that's fantastic. Get involved. If you're 18, vote this fall. What we are seeing are fewer students who have a plan to travel during this gap year, and that makes obvious sense. It's a dangerous world out there right now. So my takeaway is gap years tend to be really favorably viewed by colleges and universities as long as you're doing something constructive and productive with your time. There are any number of things that you can do during a gap year. You don't have to do a super expensive program. Those are great and they offer lots of things. But again, if you just want to work or spend time with your family, there are lots of ways you can spend your gap year and they will still be viewed really as important and valuable experiences from the college perspective. All right, thanks.
Well, thank you, you two. So I'm going to call Verto. I'm going to get my application into Lewis and Clark, and then I'm going to make my decision to do the gap year after I've been admitted. I think that's my plan. Well, this is what I do when I get this question. I get it all the time. Should I take a gap year? Can I take a gap year? Well, this is what I do. I say, young man, young lady, I would like you to make a list of things, a pro and con list. The pro reasons to go to college and the con list is why you wouldn't go right now. This is not putting college off permanently. It is a year. And that's what we call, why we call it a gap year, not a gap lifetime. So we want you to really concentrate on your prep is done in high school. You're ready to go to college, mostly. So I wrote an acronym that I want you to all write down. It is spelled SAVEU, the letter U, Save You. And it means save university for next year. Save me, you, from going this year because I have some things to do. The S stands for service. You need to do some service to somebody besides yourself. You're taking a year to do something. Now let's do something. The first thing I say is consider service to others. The second thing I say is don't get your brain off the go mode. Do something academic. The third, the V, do something of value. A value to you or a value to your community or to your family. Do something of value. This is my one. It's really spelled with a J. Get a job. Employment. E for employment. And you do something to get ready for your university, or do something to develop you, yourself. So Save You is my acronym, and I want you to keep that in mind. The next thing I do is I say, after the pro and con list, and you've written down the things you're going to do for Save You, I chunk the year. And I say, okay, it's August. Everybody's leaving. I'm going to be left alone. And the first thing I do is get a job. There is nothing like showing up. You don't have your whole year planned yet. Get a job. All the kids have left their summer jobs to go to college, and you are going to be able to walk right in and get that summer job that somebody's left the 14th of August to abandonment, and the employers are scrambling for end of the summer employees. So get a job, not a big paying one. Work for a nonprofit. Get a job. And when you show up and you have to be there on time, it's a discipline, and it is giving you some framework right away. September, you're like, oh God, the leaves are turning. What do I want to turn around? What do I want to do? Just watch the leaves? Or do I want to turn around my grades or my math aptitude or my readiness or my mindset? Take a class. We have community colleges that have credit and non-credit. Once I took an aerobics class at a community college, and it gave me the discipline to go and do something. It was inexpensive, and it was available right in my backyard. It satisfied me and interests me. Take a class, another discipline, and it can be very satisfying. October, it can get scary if you don't have your plan in place. So have things rolling before October. And you start being scared, am I too old to go to college next year? Will I look at a place and not like a freshman? By the way, by the time you're asking these questions in October, the first quarter is over. And those kids are done with their first quarter, and you are too. Your first quarter of the year is finished, and you're just getting started. Get into your service project in October. Think of it this way. By October, the pantry is bare in our community food kitchen here. Everybody starts getting generous around Thanksgiving and Christmas. They think of others, but those nonprofits need some boost and some help. October is a great month to get into your service project. November, be thankful for the time you've taken to make your life richer, fuller, more intentional, more organized, and more reflective. Ask yourself questions along the way. Say, how am I doing? What's the evidence that I'm making forward progress with this year? December, all your friends are home by the 7th of December, and they don't go back till January. So it's like old home month. You're one of the guys, one of the girls again, and you're not missing them. They're home. So I want you to really be thinking by January, are you doing something you value? Like, are you skiing or winter hiking or doing an outdoor activity, exercise, healthy things, wellness? Are you being nice? Are you being aware of others around you? Are you helping senior citizens get around in the winter? Are you shoveling without being asked or getting paid? Are you doing something around your house? Or are you being a couch potato? There's no way to get your parents as cross as sitting around doing nothing for about 6 months and then asking them to foot the bill for college come the next year. I'd make myself a useful household citizen is what I'd do. So I go through February and I go through this checklist. How's the Save You going? What are you doing? to make that going in the fall a real possibility. I have a young man right now, he's taking an AP Calc class. He did not have time to take it before. He was overwhelmed with his classes. He's not great at math, but he thought, if I take a year and take this, I could probably get better at math. He's doing that. He's taking a writing course because he knows his writing's not strong enough across the curriculum to go into college and just start writing, huge papers. So then I look at March, and I march on down to the local elementary school, and I do Read with Me or Big Buddy, or I volunteer on the field trips with my old teachers. And I'm a good role model and graduate of my high school or my school system. The elementary school always needs volunteers, and you would be a great one. So think about that. And it's not expensive to go do that a couple of hours a week. In April, I take inventory and see the progress I've made. By the way, I've journaled all the way along in this process. So I have great essay refreshers for my college application. I have an update. And when they ask that question, what should you do in that year between high school and college? I bring out my acronym, Save You, and I did all these things and I enjoyed them. And I picked a few things I particularly loved. So it's May, everybody's back, and now you can all set off to college the next fall together. You'll be a freshman, but you'll have your friends to rely on. So I want to just say, I have lots of notes on this. I'm happy to share notes with anybody who wants a high school perspective on how to craft a year. And we have a few minutes for questions here. If any, Karen or Lainey, if you want to ask them, or we can ask each other. I love the idea of that gap year fair. Lainey, how are those advertised? And how do kids get to those?
Yeah, they're really incredible, the gap year fairs. So I have been at them as a representative in the circuit, so I'm not entirely too sure how they are advertised to students, but I know that when, because they circulate through different high schools every year, so I know those high schools are good about spreading the word within that local area, and just trying to get kids from all different high schools. But I would recommend people going to the Go Overseas website, because you can see there and even just sign up for those updates. Yeah, and it's a really great time just to be able to meet people in person and actually, like, more than just reading about things online. Yeah, and I accidentally hit to answer a question live earlier. Sorry about that. So I did want to cover it so that it gets covered. And it was about the cost of gap years, which I did mean to cover and also forgot. But that question is so hard to pin down because gap years themselves range so much. There's so much variety in what students are doing. So the cost of a gap year also ranges. There are some, there's this idea of gap years costing an arm and a leg. And sometimes they can. There are very expensive gap years. Oftentimes they have a lot of things that you're doing. And, for some people, that's totally worth it. And some gap years are very, very, very affordable and might cost less than if you were just sitting at home. So there's a huge range there. Most gap year organizations, I think all, are very transparent about what their costs are. And one thing about gap organizations as well is oftentimes they will have their own scholarships, or like there's a database of scholarships for gap programs. And a lot of gap organizations are trying to make them more accessible for more students, so that a lot of them will have like sliding scales. So it's always worth it to ask a representative at that specific organization, like, give me more information about your tuition, please, because there's such a huge world there as well. So don't be dissuaded by the idea of gap years costing a lot.
And Karen, does Lewis and Clark consider an addendum? Let's say you have an admitted student that then decides to take a gap year. Do you want to hear what they did, and will it make a difference in not so much letting them back in? Because if they've been granted one, what's that process once they've been granted a gap year and then they're coming back to you in the fall? Is there any kind of in-between step they need to consider?
Mhm. So to begin with, students do need to apply and be approved to take a gap year. It's not an automatic process. So we do ask that students give us a pretty good layout of what they'll be doing during their gap year. So that is one thing to be aware of. Some schools do ask that you apply and be approved to take a gap year. So we do in general have an inkling of what students will be doing during their gap year. We will communicate with them again in December or January and just ask for an update. What have you been up to? What has your experience been like? You know, to tell us what are you doing? So we do glean a little bit more information about students. For the most part, though, that's not going to make a difference in kind of, you know, how we work with them. Their admission and their enrollment is already set. Their financial aid, for the most part, scholarships, that's already set. So it's just a matter of just kind of staying in touch with us. The only time where what a student has done during a gap year has ever made like a huge difference in terms of their enrollment at Lewis and Clark. We had a student once who did some academic work during their gap year and it did not go well at all. And unfortunately, we had to rescind their offer of admission. It went that poorly. So that's where one good piece of advice is if you are going to tackle academic work during your gap year, you still have to approach it seriously. You still need to approach it as you would, you know, being in college full time or being back in high school. You still need to take the things that you're doing during your gap year very, very seriously. I will say there are a few questions in the Q&A, and a number of them are all related to doing academic work during a gap year and does that affect how do I apply? So this is one of those questions where I'd say take that to the colleges and universities that you're interested in and ask that question, because that is a policy that's going to vary greatly from school to school. Some schools may just consider you a first year because you're not really enrolled in college during that gap year. Other schools, they may have like some sort of credit number that you have to take and earn in order to be considered a transfer student. Otherwise, you'd be a first year student. If you're earning any college credit, they're going to consider you a transfer. So that is a policy that you're going to want to clarify if the schools and the colleges and universities that you're interested in. And then I say there's another question about if you could ever defer for more than 1 year, like if you do something during a gap year and you're having a grand time and you want to extend that period of deferment. That is another question you're going to want to ask colleges and universities. But I'll say our policy at Lewis and Clark is a gap year, and you can only defer your enrollment for 1 year. The only exceptions we will ever make to a gap year turning into 2 years, if you are doing a mission and it is a 2-year mission, we will allow that. If you are doing military service and it has to be a 2-year commitment, we will allow that. But those are really the only exceptions we make. A gap year is a 1-year commitment.
Great. Well, I hope that our students will inquire with continued questions if they have them. And Lainey, is there anything else you'd like to say about Verto?
Thank you. So Verto, we are really in our own little world. We are kind of in between a gap year and a traditional college. So what Verto Education does on the broad scale is we offer fully accredited college semesters traveling abroad with that sort of gap year feel. So kind of the best of both worlds. So we do partner with 46 universities. So there's a lot to Verto, but essentially it's a great way for students to apply to Verto, take that semester or that year, so they have an option there. And if you are interested in applying to any of our partner schools, you can do that with our one application. And the credits are guaranteed to transfer to that college, but you're not limited to those. So you can take your credits to any university and we will actually confirm that they'll transfer over. So we're trying to bridge that gap between gap year and college and just make it more streamlined and more accessible for more students. So I definitely recommend people reaching out and going to the Verto Education website to check it out. We're kind of a really nice happy medium, gap year without the gap, or a taste of college, depending on the student.
All right, let's see here. I'm just looking through the Q&A, and there's some questions in there. I think about financial aid and scholarships. So again, this is going to come down to each individual institution and how they approach gap years. So, for example, at Lewis and Clark, let's say you're applying for admission for fall of 21 and you are offered admission. We give you a financial aid award that includes some scholarship funding. You tell us then, I want to accept your offer, but I'm going to defer my enrollment for a year and enroll in fall of 22. What happens with your financial aid? The scholarship that you're awarded, that will carry over into the next year. You will keep that scholarship. Need-based financial aid, because it's based on tax year information, you will actually have to reapply for financial aid during your gap year experience, and we will have to reevaluate you for need-based financial aid. I think that's probably a pretty standard policy from college to college because, again, it's based on what the federal government has to say about you. But for the most part, scholarships will keep. Need-based financial aid you'll need to be reconsidered for. But again, these are great questions to ask individually at the colleges and universities that you're interested in.
Well, I think this is a great panel, and I hope you students have received some information and some better understanding of what a gap year is. Remember, the answer is, it is what you make it. And I think there's so many cooperating partners now to do that in your own community. If you wanted an internship at a nonprofit, if you wanted some kind of work, there are so many community people that love the idea of kids getting out in the real world before they go to college and study theory, that the idea of getting hands-on is a very attractive proposition from kids to businesses. So you can ask for partners in business, in your school. I think if you're just a year out, most college counseling offices and high school counselors remember you. They know you pretty well, and they will help you make this transition. I have some kids taking a gap year right now, and they'll resend everything they need resent and help them with the forms and making sure they're reaching the right people at the college with this stuff. And if they need any renewed recommendations or anything, our offices are working really closely with the kids who choose to do this. The most important thing I understand is communication, kids. If you sit back and say nothing, and let life happen to you, that's what's going to happen. It's just going to happen to you. You're going to be a victim. If you take the proactive approach on your gap year, you can design a magnificent year. And it doesn't have to be some exotic place. You don't have to go to Africa to have a gap year. You can have a gap year in your own backyard and make it productive, intentional, and meaningful. And I think with that, if you have any more questions, kids, come on and ask them. We will get to them. All of us have your names, and we'll send out any notes that you want on this. And any suggestions, feel free to ask them in the question section, and we'll get back to you. So thank you to my panelists, Karen Dobbins-Scher from Lewis and Clark College, Lainey Pistone from Verto. It's their gap year specialist, and it sounds to me like they've got virtually everything you could be shopping for in a gap year. And don't forget your high school counselor. They're there to help you with your past to post-secondary options. And gap year is certainly one of them in these days. Thanks for attending, and I hope you better understand gap year.
Okay, I'm just popping back in for a quick second. Just want to say thank you again, like Kathy said, to all of our panelists. Hope you all enjoyed learning a little bit more about gap years. As she said, we will be sharing all of this information with you guys afterwards. The video recording of today's session will be available within about a week on the StrideScan website where you signed up for the session. So check back for that along with all of the other session recordings. And that's also where you can go to sign up for additional sessions that are being held throughout the week as well. So please take a look at that. There's a ton of great information being offered. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to any one of these three panelists and they would be happy to help you as well. So thank you all for joining us tonight. We'll see you at the next session.